This year, Mountain Voices is highlighting the research that Plymouth State faculty are doing in the White Mountains and the Lakes regions. If you're interested in seeing past presentations, I am putting into the chat there the information, and you're welcome to go to that and you'll be able to see past presentations. As Megan mentioned, this one's being recorded. So feel free to stop in there and see some of the things that have already happened. We've had some fabulous discussions. During this presentation, if you have a question or a comment you would like to make, please put it at the chat box at the bottom of the screen. We'll have time for question and answers at the end of Dr. Eisenhower's talk. In the meantime, let me introduce Brian. Dr. Brian Eisenhauer received his Ph.D. in environmental sociology from Utah State University and his master's and bachelor's degrees from Humboldt State University and Colorado State University, respectively. In 2010, Brian became the director of the Office of Environmental Sustainability at Plymouth State University. His work focuses on sustainability, grassroots activism, environmental communications, conservation, and program evaluation. He's worked on many different research projects and enjoys collaborating with students to facilitate the development of their professional skills. In his role as the director of the Office of Environmental Sustainability, Brian works with PSU faculty, staff, and students to reduce the university's environmental impacts and to help others live more sustainably through active projects and education. Tonight, Brian will be discussing the impact of second homes on the Northern Forest, a topic of great discussion to those of us interested in the White Mountains. If you have any questions during his talk, please put them in chat. And at the end of the presentation, Megan will be asking these questions to him. The floor is yours, Brian.
Well, thank you very much, Marcia. And I really want to start out by thanking the Museum of the White Mountains and all of you for taking of your time to come out and hear a little bit about second homes in the Northern Forest, a really complex issue. And before we go any further, I want to acknowledge that what we'll hear is probably what you already know. Like most things in life, second homes and their effects are neither good nor bad. It's a complex set of conditions. And maybe our role is to think about those conditions so that we can see the results we really want to see from these kinds of developments in our communities. So knowing we're on Zoom tonight, I prepared a bunch of slides so you all could look at some pictures instead of watching me in my kitchen here. So as also shared, I love to take questions. It allows me to respond to what you all are interested in. So please do use the chat. And thanks again to the Museum of the White Mountains and all of you for joining us this evening. So to begin, again, thanks to the White Mountains. And I hope everyone can see my screen okay. Okay, so thanks again to the museum. And what I'll share with you this evening, I think is can be understood starting by just considering a couple of perspectives on the issue. First off, I'm sure we have second homeowners in our audience this evening. So this question, I'm sure, is really relatable. What is it that people want from a second home? These are some of the questions that can help us think about some of the challenges and benefits that they bring. And that's often balanced against the idea of what a community wants from the second homes. And thinking about those two sides of the equation and the tension between them may be one of the pathways to thinking about what are the benefits and challenges of having a lot of second homes in a community. So I set the context for tonight's discussion based on research I've had the opportunity to do in the past, and that research was in the Northern Forest. If you're not familiar, the Northern Forest, rather than being defined by political boundaries, is defined by ecological boundaries. It's one of the nation's recognized forest landscapes. It's known for many of the things that we enjoy a high quality of life for here in New Hampshire, including lots of recreation opportunities, wildlife viewing, foliage, and all the outdoor amenities and activities that come with them. It's also a mix of forest types, both boreal, that is hardwood forests, and hardwood forests and boreal forest conifers. So there's lots of different forest industries as well. To put a visualization to it, this is the northern forest region on a map. As you can see, it crosses a lot of different states, which sets the context for the research that I'll be discussing tonight. And we chose to use this particular approach because it allowed us to look at this ecological region as the focus. However, I would point out much of what we learned, I think, really is applicability where we are at Plymouth State in New Hampshire as well. So maybe the place to start, once we know where we're talking about, is how many second homes are actually out there. I had a little trouble digging up this data, this level in the 2020 census. So I pulled this from the last study, and it's the percent of seasonal homes across the northern forest. And you can get the sense there is a very high level of seasonal ownership. In far northern New Hampshire, it's somewhere between 25 and 35%. So looking at those numbers gives you an idea of the influence that this second home dynamic can have on communities and on the landscape. The project I'm talking about tonight, really the topics are ongoing and I think a topic of interest across many fields, including tourism, especially tourism management. But a lot of the root of it is in a project I worked with collaborators from Cornell University, the University of Maine, and the University of Vermont. There are folks recognized here. And it was a project funded by the Northern States Research Cooperative that allowed us to specifically look at the social effects of second home ownership across this northern forest region. So to try and understand the impacts, and of course this study focused on social impacts, but I'll look beyond that in this evening's presentation, as much of what we learned people are concerned about is obviously well beyond just the social realm. We began with key informant interviews. I'm not going to read you the whole thing, but to give you an idea, this is the set of questions that we asked with our study community in Pittsburgh. And the way we approached this project, we had 2 study communities in each of New York State, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, and administered the same interviews and later on in the subsequent surveys to residents. So at this stage, we targeted key informants, people who work in the tourism industry, developers, community leaders, to try and understand what their ideas and concerns and beliefs were about the benefits and challenges of second homes. So what did we find out? Well, when we asked, we all know, I assume going into it, that second homes are an attraction to rural areas because of changing economies. And when traditional industries such as timber are no longer active in these areas because of globalization or other forces, second home ownership and the associated tourism offers a path perhaps to some economic viability in communities. And so when you ask about the benefits, the community tends to focus on that. But when you ask homeowners what they're looking for, they really think about the lifestyle of the northern forest, the recreational amenities. And when you consider the socioeconomic background of people who can afford second homes, seeking that kind of enjoyment makes some sense. The fact, there's also the dynamic that many second homeowners are from urban areas. So they seek many of the things that they maybe don't enjoy in those rural areas. What is important to note that might not be as readily apparent is that many second homeowners self-select their communities so that their recreational activities actually match the community culture. So what we found in Pittsburgh is that you can see at the bottom right the type of recreation second homeowners really enjoy. And in many ways, you can find patterns where the type of recreation actually matches what we think of as that place identity. Of course, there's some question how much it creates it and how much it follows it. but we were surprised to see the congruence or the similarity between what the second homeowners like to do and what we understood the local residents like to do as well. When we asked people, what do we need to know more about? What are the most important issues to learn about? They expressed that in the negative side, there is the risk of the overuse of natural resources, the fact of loving it to death, so to speak. Specifically, some folks or a lot of folks would mention that they see crowding during weekends and holiday periods. And so locals are experiencing that change and don't view it as positively. And sometimes there's the sense that second homeowners don't have the same depth of place attachment and may not have the same amount of stewardship or care. But on the positive side, the support for local businesses, the benefits to recreation and tourism, particularly in changing economies, are readily recognized as real positive outcomes of these second home developments. So we also found that while there was the sense that second homeowners are attracted to those places that fit that characteristics of the culture and the recreation they do, as I shared, they don't tend to be as active in the community. And as you can imagine, if you don't have a second home yourself, you could just imagine being in a permanent place in a second home environment. Is the second home the environment, the one where they're going to choose to be active in the community and those kinds of things? Those are the challenges that can be faced there. Of course, some of the differences are things we'd expect, knowing the challenges to economic success for people in the northern forest. The second homeowners are more affluent. So it introduces some class differences. They do have more disposable income, so that again can be a great benefit to the area. But this disconnect with the issues locally in terms of what they see as priorities may be a factor in some of the perceived differences. So after we heard from key informants, we began to feel that we had an understanding that was deep enough to survey residents. So we, again, chose two communities in each of the states. We this time went 5 states deep and ended up with 901 responses and a 45% response rate from people overall. That kind of response rate is quite good. People are motivated to talk about places they care about in the northern forest. When we get this kind of information, we do what's called non-response bias. So we look at the demographics of who responded and try and identify areas where there might be incongruence. So again, I want to recognize all the partners on these projects that really helped us through these things as well. So now that I've set the table a little bit with the introductory study that helped us understand the issues, I'll move more deeply into the topic at hand and talk about the way that we can characterize the impacts of second homes as a class. And as I already noted, these things are really complex, they're interrelated. So my intent tonight is not to dive deeply into each and every issue, but rather give you examples of the kinds of things that are going on. And to begin to break this down into classes, the first thing I did was break it down into 3 groups of social, cultural, economic, and environmental impacts. And you can see those reflected in some of the comments that I've already shared with you from the interview stages. So when we think about the social impacts of second homes, I chose a quick subset of things that are really important in the northern forest to speak about. Cultural change, the gangplank hypothesis, which I think is just an interesting dynamic to consider in second homes, public access to private land use, and community cohesion. So when second homes are developed and new residents arrive, we might ask ourselves, how would we expect the community culture to be affected? And we already know that there are some differences in just purpose for being there in the community and the fact that this is a more recreational setting. But we see, first off, that culture shifts in terms of affluence. There are typically job shifts that follow a second home growth in a community, particularly growth in service jobs, which has pros and cons to it, depending heavily on the ownership of those businesses. One of the challenges that has been associated with some second home development is the mixed effect on schools. Second homeowners make great taxpayers for towns because they pay taxes, but you don't use services as much because they're not full-time residents. So they can actually, and their average age means that they often pay taxes, but don't enroll kids in school. However, obviously, long-term with the demographics of the community, that could result in having decreasing school sizes and less young people in the community, which can have a real long-term effect. So there's a good example of some of those pros and cons dynamics. Sometimes there is a more conservation-oriented movement that follows second homes to the community. And that really is related to the gangplank hypothesis. Some of us who may enjoy second homes, or even like myself, I can share with you that I think it's okay. Megan is new to the area, so thinking about homes and things like that. And I was sharing how lucky I feel to live next to national forest land here at the end of my road off Upper Mad River Road. And I'm guilty of the gangplank hypothesis. There are some undeveloped lots in my neighborhood, and my attitude, and I'm admitting it, this is what many of us feel, especially second homeowners. Once I get my way across the gangplank, now I should pull it up so nobody else can come in and mess up what I've moved here to enjoy. And so there's an interesting dynamic there where there is this benefit often in the community of enhanced conservation, enhanced recreational opportunities, but sometimes it's at the cost of, again, this changing culture. And you could imagine how second homeowners within a community might put a lower priority on economic development or some things like that. But as I've noted, the bag is mixed. And I would be remiss if I was speaking at the White Mountain, or the Museum of the White Mountains, and didn't note that the affluence and the free time and other things that second homeowners can bring to a community can really benefit the arts. And that's not only something you see in things like museum, but simply a more active arts community as well, and support for those kinds of things. So these are just examples of some of those cultural changes that can happen, and some of the dynamics like the gangplank hypothesis that are interwoven into the way they actually take shape. One of the really big issues in the northern forest is, when it comes to recreation, is public access to private lands. And here in New Hampshire, we sometimes have a hard time envisioning that because we are so fortunate to live by the White Mountain National Forest. But as you look across the northern forest as a region, and you might, for example, think of Maine as a really good way to envision this in your mind, a lot of the recreation that we depend on to attract second homeowners and things is actually on private land. So what's been happening to lands in the northern forest? Well, as you could imagine, when we spoke with residents, people perceive that there is decreased access to private lands. And it's part of the changing economy and landscape. You can again look to the example of Maine and some in far northern New Hampshire. When large timber companies owned tracts, they were more allowing of public access. When those large parcels are fragmented into multiple private owners, there tends to be less public access. And some of that is for very legitimate concerns about liability issues and things like that. So there's a perception that access to private lands has really decreased. And of course, second homes have fragmented some of that land. And people think that land sales have really increased. That tends to be the case in most second home communities. We found that in this study, and the truth was, in that period of time, that wasn't actually true. But there was the perception that more and more houses were being, and more land was being converted to the second home dynamic. So it's one of the things to be aware of, is that long-term residents have a high sensitivity to change. And so they can perceive these things even when it's actually a flat rate of growth. I'll come back to the fact that while when we did this study, that was the story, but I would expect that with COVID-19, we've seen more changes in these kinds of homes, conversions to full-time, and I'll come back to that a little bit at the end. So why does access matter? As I mentioned, these economies are changing. The forest-based economy is much less prominent. And so now, not only is there the fragmentation, but communities see more of a reliance on nature-based tourism. When that happens and these industrial lands divest and change hands, these decisions really change. And I want to make sure I get the statistic right, but there it is. Across the northern forest, 85% of the land is privately owned. So this issue of public access, again, it's a little hard for us to understand here in New Hampshire, but when you look to places like the Northeast Kingdom and like Canterbury growing their biking networks and things like that, there is this reliance on interweaving private lands to make those things work oftentimes. So there's a bit of a tension there, but that's part of the dynamic of why access matters so much. So as a sub-study, we actually talked to landowners in 6 towns in each state to try and find out more deeply what was going on with land access. And private landowners really did reinforce the perception. The access has declined, and these are the actual landowners telling us this. And there's a challenge. They weren't really familiar with limited liability statutes. That's something that happens as more small landowners come into the picture. So there was, following this through extension across all these states, a whole lot of outreach done to try and teach people about how they can allow access on their lands. Again, there was the large perception that land sales have really been increasing. And amongst the large landowners, that was, they were fairly active in selling it, but most of the large landowners we talked to were still permanent residents. So that changes a little bit of the dynamic of allowing access. Many of them are using these lands in active production for timber, other things if they're full-time residents. So as I mentioned, this led to another project where there was outreach done about liability protections to private landowners. And since then, especially in Vermont, there's been a real increase in access and programs by the state to try and provide it, again, because of the link in the big picture between that access and the growth of economies, of which second homes are an important part. Finally, there has been a lot of concern over the years about what's called culture clash. The idea that when second homeowners come in, they're so different than the long-term residents that there's real tension between the two. And it can certainly happen, but I'm happy to say, as reinforced in what we found here about that similarity between recreation that's active in communities and what people want to do who move there with second homes. Community clash tends to be a little overplayed, we've learned. Again, people self-select where they are. So there is, a natural tendency that you don't want to go someplace where you are totally the outsider. So it happens, and good second home development recognizes that you want to avoid creating environments where second homeowners are separate from the community, where they don't share the same supermarket or things like that. But through that self-selection, the big picture of culture class over the long term is not as big a concern as it once was. So moving forward, I mean, social could take up, as I've already mentioned, I think it's 3 studies, but in the interest of time, another key aspect of the impacts of second homes is economic. And of course, for many places, this is the real driver as far as communities go. And they're providing second homeowners with the opportunities they want. Having second homeowners increases the tourism and recreational opportunities in an area. It can enhance the local economy. So there's a lot of motivations this way to think about second homes. If I was to summarize from what I've learned, just to cut to the chase, It provides some opportunities, but it is not a silver bullet, if you will, to saving communities. Challenges with local business ownership, with the seasonality of second homes, and with the low pay in some service jobs means that it can be a challenging thing to rely on for an entire community's economic base and future. That being said, it can absolutely be an important and really positive part of a town's portfolio, if you will, of their economic base. So as you'd imagine, I would imagine, I shouldn't put ideas in your head, but in these rural areas where the economy may be struggling, where it was traditionally forest industries, many people feel that the second homes bring a positive effect on the economy. Again, I mentioned earlier, they may pay taxes but not use the services as much. And because of income differences, they may have more disposable income to spend in town and things like that. Of course, there are economic concerns. House prices go up. I bet if some of you are long-term residents of this region, you may know some people on Squam or other lakes in the region who have very expensive property taxes because of how house values have gone up and things like that. So that's just an example. Those things can be controlled if a town government decides to do so. But those are examples of some of the things that can happen with house prices going up. The gentrification may fall on a cultural or social effect, but in economic concerns, part of the question may be what businesses are attracted to serve the second homeowners and how do they relate to the other residents of the town? Do they resonate? Because again, having separate communities tends not to be as productive in the long run as you would assume. The seasonality is a factor. If we are a lake second home site, then considering what's going to happen in winter can be a real issue for full-time workers. I'm the director of sustainability at Plymouth State, which is a job I really enjoy. And I would be remiss if I didn't note that one of the challenges economically as well with second homes is that they have to absorb energy to maintain heat and all those things, even when they aren't in use. So at a community scale, there's an energy cost to that as well as a personal cost. Less workers proportionally. I mentioned the school population before, and that business aspect of gentrification can be a challenge as mentioned. So what are some of those benefits? Simply growing the local economy. That's the biggest one. And it has particular benefits if the way the growth is produced is consciously managed. Are there building codes and requirements that could support local industries, things of that nature? These are some, and thinking about the long-term jobs created, not just the boom jobs created, that is when the places are being built, is part of the challenge, but some of the benefits that can really result. Again, second homes tend to increase a tourist market. They create awareness, they share those things, they share stories, certainly in this age of social media. So there's a real benefit there as well. And if one was to try and think about what are some of the key questions one should ask if thinking about the economic impacts, again, jumping back to that balance between what second homeowners and what a community would like to benefit from, give you some of the guidelines of the core to think about when considering the questions we should reflect on when thinking about the economic impacts of second homes. So the last area I wanted to touch on this evening and leave time for questions is some of the environmental impacts of second homes. Again, jumping back to the interview, we thought about the perceptions to begin with and found that positively people believe that second homeowners have the respect for the environment. That's why they've chosen to be there. And they tend to be more outspoken and proactive about participating in environmentally friendly behavior. When we're talking about second homes in high amenity regions like the Northern Forest, that's why we see that alignment. They're choosing to live and celebrate in that natural environment that was reflected in those decisions. The negative aspects, of course, also exist. We should recognize that second homeowners are commuting between their primary residency and their second home, so that adds to an environmental footprint. As one of the cultural impacts, and I mentioned these things cross over, there is an increased use of local recreation, maybe trails and things like that, and that not only has crowding effects, it also has effects environmentally, runoff and other things, and the quality of the trails and the environment that they're in. And second homeowners are obviously increasing the population of the town, so that increases the demands on the local environment, simple as things like water resources and so on. So there are some challenges about it. The energy usage I mentioned, soil erosion and runoff I mentioned earlier because of that increased trail use. But of course, when we think about second homes on lakes, it might be the management of those lakefront properties that may be even bigger issue when it comes to soil erosion and runoff. And I'll come back to that topic in a moment, but it's one of those things I wanted to mention when you see that on the list. It's not just the trails. Perhaps an even larger issue is the impacts of the home building and then the homes themselves. Habitat fragmentation. Adding more homes, adding more developments fragments the habitat that we're celebrating. It makes smaller and smaller contiguous parcels for wildlife. So over the long term, that can have really negative effects on things like wildlife corridors, the areas that wildlife moves in seasonally or otherwise to access different areas. Then the water quality, and as mentioned, the soil erosion runoff is one source of that. We can talk about impervious surfaces from roads and things, but the lake is a good place to really focus. We know a lot of second homes, particularly in the Plymouth area, are really focused on the lake. And so here is just a quick list of some of the ways that activities associated with second homes might impact lakes. And you see a very eutrophic lake there. So some heavy phosphorus loading is making that algal bloom. However, like all second home issues, it is not a question of it being good or bad, but rather, I believe, recognizing that we can minimize the negatives. And so doing things like providing proper septic and filtration system, helping people making sure there's a buffer between lawns and the lake so that nutrients don't run right in. These kinds of things can really protect water quality. And over at Newfound Lake and some other areas in our region, they have great examples of how this is possible. So again, it's one of the places we can say second homes is not something that's inherently positive or negative. It's the management of it and how we see it take shape that really tells the tale. When we're building, just thinking about the building itself, we know that there are environmental impacts. So some communities require second homes or developments that are targeted for second homeowners to adhere to high environmental standards through building codes and otherwise. So we could talk, and it's an important issue. For instance, here in New Hampshire, our buildings are a major contributor to global warming. Over half of our emissions come from our buildings. So the overall goal, recognizing that that's going to be true across the Northern Forest, given the climate similarities, is to rely on some green building techniques to decrease fossil fuel consumption. For us, that's heating. Over time, as climate continues to change, we will have more extreme heat days, so we'll need to think about it both ways as we move into the future. But obviously, although it seems warm relatively now, we know we have really cold winters. So that's our major footprint. These rural areas are the areas that provide ecosystem services like clean water that we all depend on downstream. So thinking about things like water efficiency as well as the energy efficiency are going to be some of the best principles in minimizing the impacts of buildings in and of themselves. And I ended this list with the note about environmentally appropriate landscaping. That obviously relates to what I was mentioning just a minute ago about lakes and the management of runoff. But in the ideal, we could even think about encouraging people to consider food production, community gardens, things like that to replace lawns that they probably don't want to maintain on their second home anyway. Finally, one of the things that's really interesting about second homes is the effects on land use conservation. As I mentioned earlier, second homeowners in this region are drawn to natural amenities, so they tend to support conservation. And I want to point out, conservation is different than preservation. Preservation might be, no use. We know that when we look in the northern forest, there's a long history of forest uses. And so a lot of people protect lands with easements and things that allow for sustainable forestry and active forestry in forms. And so when we think about second homes, there is the possibility to see them actually result in a positive land conservation trend. That can result from that kind of community culture change, but it could conceivably result from the way second homes are developed themselves. So in the large picture, if there is a development that's going in for second homes, when we think about second homes, we again might do things like really plan for allowing active land use so that conservation tradition in the area is allowed to continue, which might support a more robust full season economy. We might require buffer zones between lakes and lawns and rivers and lawns and streams and lawns to maintain that water quality. If we want to try and present all the benefits second homes can offer to communities, we want to make sure that even exclusively second home developments provide public access. Obviously, that's one of those things that can help break down that culture clash if there's not an exclusive end to access and things like that. And when second homeowners are really marketed to, this conservation is something they're interested in. So I think a question as I'm moving towards the conclusion, I move very quickly, but I wanted to try and leave 15 minutes for questions, as I was told we'll go for an hour, and I think we see 10 in there, 10 questions or comments. So I think hopefully I'll get a chance to take them all, and I'll take as long as you want. But before I conclude, I wanted to note that COVID-19 has really affected second homes a lot. I'm sure some of you are aware that states like Vermont and New Hampshire have been growing fairly rapidly during COVID-19 because of the same amenities that attract people to second homes. And one of the things we've seen in this time period is second homes being converted to permanent homes as people are more interested in the rural way of life and telecommuting becomes more common. So to tell you the truth, I don't yet know the numbers on the impact of COVID-19, but I will be very interested to see whether it results in an increase or decrease. Based on what I know now and just shared with you, I'd expect that second homes are on the decrease simply because of this desire to live in the area and some of that transition, combined with a very robust housing market at this point. So second homes are not something that a community decides in and of themselves. It is always in the context of things like COVID-19 or economic cycles such that affect the price of forest products and all kinds of things like that. And that's one of the reasons why second homes need to be relied on carefully as an economic engine. While they offer many benefits, the fact that they are subject to so many outside forces means that to create a resilient economy, there needs to be other pieces at play as well. So to conclude, the impacts can be broken down. There are so many and they're interrelated, but they can be broken down into those economic, environmental, and social categories. And it aligns very well with some of the principles of sustainability itself, where we want to think about our activities across the spectrum of environment, societal, and economic impacts. And it recognizes that much like in the communities that host or attract second homes, without a thriving environment, the economy will deteriorate and the places that people are attracted to won't exist as much. So in these communities, it's a great example of how where we live in the built environment and what we are surrounded by, and it really embedded with, I shouldn't say surrounded by, embedded with in terms of the environment, really has an impact on quality of life, the economy, and they drive each other. So we need to perhaps eliminate, or try, it's an ideal, but eliminate the idea of it's the environment or the economy. Rather, it's a question of balance. It's not about that one has to be hurt or caught at the cost of the other. And if you were to ask me, what are the top things that you could actually implement, because I talked about a lot of abstract issues, I just wanted to end with things very concrete. If I was to suggest keys for making second home development more sustainable, it's something that is a changing culture, but having high density of second homes surrounded by shared conservation land would be best practices for the environment, instead of having multiple acre parcels. If everybody's on 5 acres, there's a lot of fragmentation. A sustainable site plan requirement, that is a review by town, and you can see some of the other aspects of buildings and their settings that could be really embraced in order to improve the sustainability of second homes. So again, I want to thank the museum and thank all of you for taking the time to listen and to what is a really complex picture. There's so much to share, but I hope, if anything, this gave you a way to consider what you might want to learn more about. So thanks again to the museum, and thanks to all of you. And I'd be very happy to take any questions that I can. Oops.
Thanks, Brian. That was great. As you were watching the numbers go up, there's definitely been a lot of great conversation in the chat. And so I wanted to start out with a comment from Rosemary Darcy. She says, second home owners also have no say in town government, so cannot influence how towns spend their tax dollars. So I wondered if you had any sort of thoughts on that kind of disenfranchisement of second home owners.
That is, it can vary from town to town, but that is absolutely true. And it is a good example of the culture clash as well, that sometimes that happens by rule and sometimes it happens by force of sort of push, if you will, for lack of a better way to say it. I think it's a really important concern because, as mentioned, the more, at least from what we understand, the more second homeowners are integrated into the community, the better, and that they can then reap both sides of those benefits just more effectively, if nothing else, simply through communication. So I would agree that's an unfortunate circumstance. I think sometimes, and I'll conclude with this, I think it can be perhaps understandable. I try and think with some empathy. I could imagine a town being concerned that the long-term residents might be outnumbered or something. And unfortunately, it's those kind of concerns about culture clash that can really drive that stuff. But I agree, the best practices would be to have that voice.
Thanks. So Becky Moore had 2 questions. I'll read the sort of first one, and then we can dive into the second one afterwards. She says, with regard to the mapped areas with a high percentage of second homes, how does the impact between camps and houses differ? For example, camps may not have septic systems that homes do. Yep.
This that was taken from census data. So I can't quote you the definition off the top of my head, but it's what the census uses for the definition of a home. So I believe that has a bathroom requirement and would not include camps. So that's a good point, that that data includes only homes. It doesn't really include people who own property and just property, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks. And then further, what impact does the increase of second home purchases for short-term Airbnb sort of rental market have on resident communities?
That is a really challenging question that's still unfolding. So the thinking is that, I mean, you're asking me to get on my high horse, so I guess I'm going to do it. Or not you, I know, but that's the question, and I appreciate that. In my opinion, it's a dangerous future, because if we express concern, just as we heard in the other question about the involvement and the opportunities for involvement, having absentee landlords is only going to exacerbate that issue. So I think it's an issue of concern. It's a growing market, as we all know. From a user standpoint, I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy it. But from a looking at, and I always like to be honest about those things, but in terms of what's best for the community, I really have concerns. Now, I'll conclude, what would I do? Perhaps, I don't know, but maybe there's a way to regulate the percentage of those in a community or something. That's moving well into a legal expertise beyond mine, but just throwing an idea about there of how it might be managed if it's possible.
Yeah, and it definitely has interesting interconnections with the town governance questions when things like this are discussed and debated and voted on at town meeting, and March may or may not be a time when people are around and are probably not registered voters. It definitely.
And you know, and I got to say, I could even draw another connection. Like, I could imagine that if I was a local resident and I was concerned about Airbnbs, that might be a reason I won't want those people on that town council or whatever. So it is really interrelated.
Right. You might actually agree to be on the zoning board.
It's not good.
So Larry Spencer had a comment about, or I guess a question that you sort of touched on later. This came earlier while you were still talking, but I didn't know if you want anything to add about second homeowners, when second homeowners become primary homeowners because of COVID, and he brings up specifically comparing Molten Borough to Plymouth, was his comment. So I didn't know if you wanted to add anything more there, or.
Well, I'm not, I mean, I don't know Molten Borough numbers well enough, but I would imagine Molten Borough saw a big population increase relative to Plymouth in those time periods. So it's affecting some of the numbers in that way, and town services and all those things as a result. I would also imagine that it's one of the things, I'm sorry to say to you, is probably driving up house prices and things like that as well.
I was lamenting at the beginning that the thing that is my biggest concern in the world right now is finding somewhere where my whole family can live, not some of us in our second home, which I also have my own sort of shame about my privilege, and me in an apartment here. So that was a little part of our earlier conversation. And we had another comment from Rosemary Darcy, said that the impact on town services, police, fire, et cetera, is also significant. And I think I want to tie that to a comment a little later down, which was also about the solid waste. And there was a question from Mark Runquist that said, did the impact of increase in solid waste, you may know the Campton Thornton transfer station was overwhelmed with refuse from second homes, permanent during COVID, that they had to close one day on weekends because of space limitations and capacity. And Hannah Vollmer also added that the transfer station wasn't recycling at that time either.
Yes. Well, first off, I used to go on Sundays, so I am very upset about this because my routine, I mean, there I was, I went on Sunday and the gates closed, so I hear you. Let me first say that part of the recycling is wrapped up in the global recycling market and China's change in what goods they're willing to accept. So I just wanted to note that that's again in the background of all this. I am not surprised to hear that there was an increase on town services during COVID. Normally, second homeowners are viewed as folks who pay taxes and use less services. There may be demands at times, but simply because they're not there all the year or all the time, that's the general view. But as we saw during COVID, I even thought, just from living where I do up towards Waterville, I noticed a lot more out-of-state plates that seem to be around all the time. And so that's where I expect the comment about the transfer station comes. And I don't think that's anything we really thought of before COVID. I can't think of another situation, at least during my lifetime, that pushed people so forcefully into a different setting for full-time living. So it is an interesting thing to think about, but it's such a good question. I don't think anyone's really researched it much beyond the experiences we've just all had.
Yeah, thanks.
Did I answer all parts? I'm going to assume yes. For moving on.
Yeah, I think so. And then there was a comment from Hannah Volmer. Says there's also an issue of town changing its regulations to lessen impacts of second homes. However, this can negatively affect low-income locals / permanent residents. An example of requiring sprinkler systems in new homes, even small cabins.
Yes, absolutely. That's part of that affluence dynamic where sometimes the best practices we want for those can have unintended consequences, just like you identified. So it's one of those challenging things to regulate. There is no doubt about it. So I have nothing to say except that's a great point and an excellent example of some of the complications that, unfortunately, I certainly don't have an easy answer to.
Yeah. And Larry Spencer also commented, I think while you were talking about things we could do in terms of conservation and things, that the shoreline protection legislation already designates the zones between the water body and development associated with that water body.
It does, but that's not in action across all. That's a New Hampshire thing, not across all the states. Plus, I'd hope that we could do better than some of the shoreline protection requirements, but his point is well taken, and that's exactly the kind of legislation we need to make sure this happens at the big scale.
And there was a comment that Will Ritchie wanted to ask a question, but I'm not sure he's still here. Are you still here? He's not. Okay, thanks, Marcia. So sorry we missed that. And then Larry Spencer also commented that Guilford is considering the issue of the moment in terms of Airbnb. And I will say this is a big issue in Dummer last year. We were living up there in our house because we were working remotely, and I know that it was an issue of what do we do about these, and how do we, and that's in a town of 300 people. So
absolutely. And I don't know if Adam Coyle is still in the room or whatever, and I'm not calling him out or anything, but Adam and I work on the tourism management policy program at Plymouth State. So the Airbnb phenomenon is also a fascinating thing and a challenging thing to think about for students interested in that field. Yeah, enough said. It's been a big change. Yeah.
And Rosemary Darcy had another comment, said the shoreline protection is difficult to reinforce unless abutters let someone know. So it becomes also not only an issue of the legislation itself, but the enforcement.
I smile because I really love living in New Hampshire. I've lived here longer than anywhere else. But live free or die sometimes means live free or die. And a lot of times we have I shouldn't say a lot of times, there are cases where we have very well-intended regulations that don't have the enforcement behind them that they need to be as active as we'd like, or as active as I'd like. Excuse me.
Becky Moore had another comment. It said, your excellent presentation suggests that towns may need to rethink best practices in developing effective methods for managing these challenges. And I think definitely given us all a lot to think about and to share with.
Yes, the sad truth is yeah, I'm going to say it. Just about everything I shared is contradictory to live free or die. In the sense that in order to really, and I want to say this consciously, it's not just about minimizing the negative impacts, it's about maximizing the benefits. But to achieve both those things, from what I understand and have learned across the region, there does have to be some planning involved. And I get so careful about saying that because it is New Hampshire, and somehow that's like saying something political here. Next thing you know, I'm going to say we should have income tax. Totally kidding.
As long as there's still no sales tax, we'll be okay.
That's all right. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Brian. This was fabulous. I have my own list of questions, but I'll ask those another time. And I know that Marcia wants to share some information about our upcoming talks as well.
Well, again, before she does, just thanks again to the museum. I really appreciate the opportunity to share the time and talk about a topic I think is interesting. And thanks to all of you who took out of your time to tune in. Really appreciate it. And I hope you'll come check out the museum stuff again.
Thanks, Brian. You've given lots of great things to think about, and really appreciate you sharing all your information. You're just a wealth of knowledge, and we appreciate it. You know, in order to make things like this happen, however, we need donations. And so I want to urge everyone to support the Museum of the White Mountains. I just put in the donation in the donation button. You can become a member and support through your membership. You can send a donation. You can come to the museum. There's a donation box there, however you would like to contribute to the museum. We depend upon you and everything that you can help us do. I also want to mention that our next Mountain Voices talk is by Professor Adam Kuhl, who Brian just mentioned. It'll take place on March 10th at 7 p.m. And Adam will be speaking on maps in the White Mountains in a presentation he calls A More Civilized Wild, Power and Purpose in White Mountain Cartography. We look forward to seeing everyone again then. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming. And thank you again.